when we think of a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of clinical precision.
Right.
Like engineering,
Yeah.
you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
It's binary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Broken or not broken, it's clean, it's visible, and honestly, it's comforting because it can be perfectly categorized. But then you step into the world of ancient empires, and suddenly someone just takes a sledgehammer to that x-ray machine.
Yeah, the lines completely vanish.
Well, looking at a historical landscape that is just completely murky. Like, we desperately want clear lines of good guys and bad guys, or simple cause and effect. But when you look closely at antiquity, it is a tangled web of contradictions.
Oh, absolutely.
You have these civilizations building unimaginable, genius-level infrastructure, while simultaneously, practicing the most brutal, capricious violence imaginable.
And that contradiction is really the defining feature of the era we are exploring today. It's the absolute definition of muddy waters. Because, you cannot apply modern moral frameworks to societies that operated on a fundamentally different understanding of the universe.
Their whole worldview is different.
Exactly. Of human life, of power. If you try to sanitize it, you lose the actual mechanics of how these empires functioned.
Which is exactly why we are here. If you are listening to this right now, maybe you're on your commute, maybe you're out for a run, we are going to take you down into those muddy waters.
It's going to be a deep one.
We are looking at a massive stack of historical research detailing the rise, the culture, and the eventual plateau of pre-Islamic Persia. Specifically, we are zeroing in on the Medes and the Achaemenid Empire.
A fascinating period.
But our mission for this deep dive isn't just to recite, a timeline of dead kings and dusty battles.
Yeah.
We're looking for the aha moments.
The real human elements.
Right. We want to extract the ultimate shortcut to understanding how one of the most successful ancient empires actually operated on a day-to-day level. We're looking beyond the battlefields to find the insights about human nature, about the staggering, mind-bending scale of imperial administration.
And the theology, too.
Yes. How a literal cosmic battle between good and evil shaped everything from the laws of the land to, how a merchant washed their hands. So, okay, let's unpack this, because the scale we are talking about is almost incomprehensible for the ancient world.
It really is.
We are looking at 20 massive provinces, or satrapies, 40 million souls.
Right.
An empire stretching all the way from the burning sands of Egypt to the borders of India.
To put that in perspective, it was the largest political organization of pre-Roman antiquity.
Wow.
And arguably, when it was functioning at its peak, one of the best governed in history. But, that governance was hard-won. Before there was a Persian Empire, before the vast highways and the gold coinage, there was the rugged, mountainous foundation laid by their predecessors.
The Medes.
Right, the Medes. And to understand the Persians, you really have to understand the Medes. History is essentially a book that we are forced to begin reading in the middle.
I always struggle to picture who the Medes actually were before they became this imperial powerhouse. Where do they even come from?
Their origins are somewhat elusive, but the archaeological and linguistic evidence points to them being Indo-Europeans.
Okay.
They likely migrated down from the shores of the Caspian Sea, perhaps 1,000 years before Christ. They wandered through regions like Bokhara and Samarkand, moving steadily south until they found themselves in the Zagros Mountains.
Which is the rugged terrain of what would become Western Iran and Kurdistan, right?
Exactly. And the environment they settled in is completely crucial to understanding them.
Because the sacred scriptures that would later define this region, they actually idealized this ancient homeland as a paradise, right? But the reality of those mountains is brutal.
Oh, yeah. It's a deeply human instinct to romanticize the past, especially the scenes of our youth, provided we don't actually have to live in them again.
Yeah, fair point.
The reality of the Zagros Mountains was incredibly harsh. Freezing winters, difficult terrain. But that harshness is exactly what forged them. They became tough out of sheer necessity.
They had to, just to survive.
Right. They learned to extract copper, iron, lead, gold, and silver from those mountains. They developed a prosperous agriculture in the valleys. They were simple, vigorous, and hardened by their environment.
But they weren't an empire yet.
No, not at all. At their early stage, they weren't a unified nation. They were just a collection of 27 chieftain kings ruling over thinly populated, rugged mountain tribes.
So how does a loose collection of mountain chieftains suddenly become a centralized threat to the Assyrian Empire? Because the Assyrians were the dominant superpower of the time.
It requires a catalyst. A transition from a tribal society to a centralized power always requires a singular figure to consolidate authority.
And for the Medes, that was Deioces.
Yes, their first king, Darius. And his rise to power is just a masterclass in psychological manipulation and the curation of authority.
Walk me through that. Because he doesn't
Yeah.
just, conquer them with a bigger army, does he?
No, he uses a much more insidious tool, which is reputation. According to the ancient Medes, Deices initially gained influence simply by acquiring a reputation for extreme, incorruptible justice.
Uh,
In a chaotic tribal society, a fair arbitrator is incredibly valuable. People from all over started coming to him to resolve disputes. He essentially made himself indispensable.
I see.
But once he had the consolidated power and was named king, he realized a fundamental truth of leadership. Familiarity breeds contempt.
Oh, right. If the people see him every day, eating, sleeping, getting sick, maybe tripping over a rock, they realize he's just a guy.
Precisely.
Yeah.
If they see his humanity, they will naturally question his authority.
Wow.
So Deices completely isolates himself.
He just locks himself away.
Yeah. He founds their first capital at Ecbatana, which translates to a meeting place of many ways. It's situated in this picturesque, fertile valley. He builds this massive royal palace spread over an area 2/3 of a mile square, and then he just shuts the doors. He issues incredibly strict regulations. No man is allowed to be admitted to the king's presence. Every single consultation, every legal judgment has to be done through messengers passing notes back and forth.
That is wild. He's manufacturing the illusion of divinity by entirely erasing his physical presence. I read that he even made it a literal crime, like a punishable indecency for anyone to laugh or spit in his presence on the rare occasions he was actually seen.
Yeah, the goal was to appear to be of a completely different nature to those who did not see him. It's a calculated psychological barrier.
It's ancient PR.
Exactly, ancient public relations. By removing himself from the mundane reality of daily life, he becomes an abstraction. He becomes an idea of absolute unyielding authority rather than a flesh and blood human being who might, have a bad day or make a mistake.
And it clearly works, because under his leadership, the Medes become this formidable military machine, which sets the stage for the greatest of the Median kings, Cyaxares.
Right.
He's the one who finally turns this mountain army into an unstoppable force, isn't he?
Cyaxares is the true architect of the Median Empire. He organizes the army into specialized units, spearmen, archers, cavalry, instead of just a chaotic horde of warriors.
Professionalizing them.
Yes. And he uses this refined military machine to finally settle the score with Assyria. He allies with the Babylonians, and together they utterly destroy Nineveh, the Assyrian capital.
Which was a massive deal.
It's a world-shattering event in antiquity. Inspired by that massive victory, Cyaxares sweeps his army through Western Asia. They are this unstoppable force of momentum, pushing all the way to the very gates of Sardis in Asia Minor, taking on the Lydian Empire.
But then during the Battle of the Hales, one of the most cinematic moments in ancient history happens. They are locked in combat, and suddenly the sky just goes dark.
A total solar eclipse. You really have to put yourself in the mindset of an ancient soldier. If you're listening to this, imagine you are standing on a dusty battlefield covered in blood. You don't have orbital mechanics or astronomy to explain what is happening.
Right. There's no science to fall back on.
To you, the sun itself, which is universally associated with the highest divine powers, the source of all life and light, is literally being extinguished in the middle of the day.
It must have felt like the end of the world. Like the gods were just pulling the plug on reality.
It completely stopped the war dead in its tracks. The opposing leaders, Cyaxares and the Lydian king, were so panicked by this apparent cosmic ceasefire order that they immediately dropped their weapons.
Just right there on the battlefield.
Yeah, they negotiated a treaty of peace on the spot. And to seal it, to ensure they didn't anger the heavens any further, they literally cut their arms and drank each other's blood.
Wow.
It's a stark reminder of the deeply superstitious and visceral world they lived in. A solar eclipse was enough to halt an empire's expansion and force a blood pact between bitter enemies.
So Cyaxares expands his kingdom into a massive empire, embracing Assyria, Media, and Persia. He builds this incredible foundation. But he dies shortly after. And this is where the story of the Medes takes a really sharp downward turn under his son, Astyages.
A very sharp turn.
It reminds me of those stories you hear about someone who wins a massive $100 million lottery jackpot, and 5 years later they're completely bankrupt, living in a motel, and their life is in ruins.
That's a great analogy. It's the sudden wealth syndrome. But on a geopolitical scale, the Medes acquired wealth and power far too quickly to figure out how to manage it structurally or psychologically.
They didn't have the systems in place.
Right. Astyages inherited an empire that his father and grandfather had bled for. He didn't have the struggle that forged them. He inherited the kingdom with total equanimity and just settled down to enjoy the spoils.
And it infected everyone.
Under his example, the entire nation forgot its stern morals and stoic ways.
The degeneration is shocking. These are people who, literally a single generation ago, prided themselves on being rugged mountain warriors. They were happy to ride around in crude wagons with wheels chopped straight out of tree trunks. Suddenly, the upper classes are entirely enslaved by fashion and luxury. The men are wearing elaborately embroidered trousers. The women are covered in cosmetics and heavy jewelry. It gets to the point where they're outfitting their horses in gold caparisons.
And just to clarify for those who might not know, a caparison is an ornamental covering spread over a horse's saddle or harness. But the Medes weren't using cloth. They were plating their horses' gear in solid gold.
It's ridiculous.
It's the ultimate symbol of a society that has lost its edge. It's the classic historical arc, you know? Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men.
But Astyages wasn't just soft and luxurious. He was also deeply paranoid and unimaginably cruel. The early Median kings, like Darius, prided themselves on justice. Astyages replaces justice with terrifying sadism.
Very true.
And we have to talk about the story of his official, Harpagus, because it is one of the most gruesome catalysts for a rebellion I've ever encountered.
It is genuinely horrific, and it perfectly illustrates the absolute unchecked power of an ancient despot. Astyages becomes displeased with Harpagus, his top general and most trusted advisor.
Right.
Astyages secretly has Harpagus's own son murdered. But he doesn't stop there. He has the boy dismembered and the meat cooked into a stew. He then invites Harpagus to a grand royal banquet and serves him this meat.
Just the sheer psychological torture of that. Harpagus is eating, having no idea. And then Astyages just reveals what it is.
Yes. Once Harpagus is finished eating, Astyages has his servants bring out a covered basket. He tells Harpagus to open it. Inside is the severed head, hands, and feet of his son.
Oh, God.
Astyages then asks him how he enjoyed the meal.
It turns my stomach just thinking about it. But the darkest part isn't even the act itself. It's Harpagus's reaction.
Yes.
When he realizes what he's just eaten, he doesn't flip the table. He doesn't draw a sword and attack the king. He swallows his horror, looks at the king, and calmly says that whatever a king does is agreeable to him. He then gathers the remains of his son and goes home.
That moment is a profound testament to the cold, calculating nature of Harpagus and his deep understanding of power.
He knew he couldn't win in that moment.
Right. He feigned submission because he knew that a momentary outburst of anger meant his immediate death. He would achieve nothing. Instead, he chose the long game of revenge.
Yeah, what a revenge it was.
He waited, he plotted, he maintained his position of trust, and he quietly began sending secret messages to a young, brilliant rebel from a vassal state called Anshan. He helped this rebel organize an uprising to overthrow Astyages.
And that rebel's name was Cyrus, Cyrus the Great.
When Cyrus finally rebelled against the effeminate, cruel despot of Ecbatana, Harpagus was put in charge of the Median army sent to crush him.
Which was a terrible idea by Astyages.
A fatal mistake. Of course, Harpagus immediately defected with the entire army. The Medes themselves basically welcomed Cyrus. In one single engagement, Media ceased to be the master of Persia, and Persia became the master of Media.
It's a breathtaking pivot. But before we leave the Medes entirely, I think we need to highlight their legacy. Because their tenure as an empire was incredibly brief. Did they actually leave anything behind, or were they just a flash in the pan?
Oh, they were the vital scaffolding. The Medes might have failed politically, but they provided the cultural software that the Persian Empire would later run on.
Okay, like what?
To Persia, the Medes gave their Aryan language. They gave them a 36-character alphabet. They introduced the innovation of replacing heavy clay tablets with parchment and pen for writing materials.
I want to pause on that because moving from clay to parchment sounds like a small detail, but it's actually a massive leap forward in administrative technology, isn't it?
Massive.
You can't run a sprawling, continent-spanning empire on heavy, breakable clay tablets that take days to dry. You need lightweight, easily transportable information.
Exactly. It's the difference between mailing a brick and sending an email. It allowed for rapid communication. The Medes also gave the Persians their extensive use of the column in architecture, which would define the magnificent Persian palaces at Persepolis later on.
Right.
They handed down a moral code, a patriarchal family structure, and most importantly, they provided the early roots of the Zoroastrian religion and a body of strict law that would eventually become famous as the unalterable law of the Medes and the Persians.
So they built the foundational infrastructure, the language, the alphabet, the religion, the laws, and then basically handed the keys over to Cyrus, who knew exactly how to drive the machine.
Perfect way to put it.
We are entering the era of the great kings.
Yeah.
And the contrast between the first three great kings, Cyrus, his son Cambyses, and eventually Darius provides an incredible study in the different styles of imperial leadership.
Let's start with Cyrus. How did he operate differently from the despots who came before him? Cyrus is a fascinating figure because he recognized that raw military power has a very short half-life. The ancient sources describe him as handsome, romantic, and a brilliant military tactician.
A real golden boy of history.
Truly. He organized an invincible army and conquered Babylon, ending 1,000 years of Semitic rule in Western Asia. But his true genius wasn't in how he won battles. It was in what he did the day after he won.
Which was?
He founded his empire upon generosity.
Which is completely counterintuitive for the ancient world.
Yeah.
Usually conquest meant sacking cities, burning temples, stealing the gold, and enslaving the surviving populations.
But Cyrus realized a fundamental psychological truth. If you crush a people entirely, if you take away their gods and their dignity, you leave them with nothing to lose.
They'll just keep fighting.
They will fight you with desperate, suicidal courage, and they will rebel the moment your back is turned. Cyrus gave them a reason not to fight to the death.
A great example of this is how he handled Croesus of Lydia. Croesus was notoriously wealthy. He's where the phrase rich as Croesus comes from. When Cyrus defeated him, he didn't execute him. According to the histories, he actually rescued Croesus from the executioner's pyre and made him one of his most honored, highly paid counselors.
He treated the Jews magnanimously as well, famously freeing them from their Babylonian captivity.
Right, allowing them to return to Jerusalem and even giving them the funds to rebuild their temple.
He applied this principle universally. His foundational policy was religious freedom. He understood what might be the first great principle of statesmanship. Religion is stronger than the state.
That is a profound realization for an ancient conqueror.
You can defeat a king's army, you can tax a merchant's wealth, but if you try to destroy a people's gods, you are attacking their very soul. They will harbor a multi-generational hatred for you.
I read that when he finally conquered Babylon, a city with massive walls that had resisted him for a long time, he didn't tear down their ziggurats, their massive terraced temple towers. He actually preserved their sanctuaries.
Yes, he walked right into the city, bowed to the Babylonian god Marduk, and offered pious sacrifices.
He literally paid for the upkeep of the local divinities wherever he went. But I have to ask, did Cyrus do this out of a genuine, modern sense of open-minded tolerance? Was he an enlightened philosopher king? Or was this pure geopolitical pragmatism?
It is so tempting to view him through a modern lens as a champion of human rights, but we have to be realistic. If you are a single king trying to govern 40 million people across diverse cultures spanning 2 million square miles, you cannot afford to have a religious insurgency erupting in every province.
You'd run out of soldiers in a week.
You simply don't have the manpower or the logistics to put out those fires. By funding their local gods, he bought their loyalty.
It's an investment in peace. He made it comfortable for the conquered to accept his rule. You can keep your customs, you can speak your language, you can pray to your gods, just pay your taxes to Susa and send your young men when I call for an army.
It is a brilliant, sustainable model of empire.
But he didn't live long enough to truly organize its internal bureaucracy. He died in battle, pushing the eastern frontiers. And that left the empire to his son, Cambyses.
Cambyses is a masterclass in how to completely unhinge an empire in record time.
Yeah, quite the downgrade.
If Cyrus built the empire through psychological statecraft and generosity, Cambyses nearly tore it apart through forced assimilation and a descent into murderous paranoia.
He seems like he inherited his father's ambition, but absolutely none of his wisdom. The campaign in Egypt is where it all falls apart, right?
Yes. Cambyses launched a massive campaign to conquer the Nile, lured by the immense wealth of Egypt. And initially, he succeeded in capturing Memphis. But the logistical realities of the region, combined with his own hubris, totally fractured his mind.
Because he tried to push too far.
He decided he wanted to conquer the oasis of Ammon, deep in the Sahara Desert, and Carthage further west.
Wait, so he sends an army into the deep desert. I read that he sent an army of 50,000 Persian soldiers into the Sahara, and they just vanished. How does an empire not immediately collapse from losing 50,000 men to the sand?
It was a devastating blow. Marching an army of that size across a desert requires meticulous logistical planning. You need water trains, navigational guides, way stations. Cambyses seemingly ignored all of this.
Unbelievable.
The army was caught in a massive campsin, a violent, suffocating sandstorm that can last for days. 50,000 men were literally buried alive by the desert.
What a nightmare.
Then his Phoenician naval crews refused to sail against Carthage because Carthage was a Phoenician colony. They refused to attack their own people. Everything Cambyses tried began to fail.
And rather than reassessing his strategy, he just loses his mind. He completely abandons his father's wise policy of religious tolerance. Instead of humoring the Egyptian gods, he publicly scoffs at them. He actively tries to destroy their faith.
Yes, he digs up ancient mummies, he pries into royal tombs ignoring the curses, he burns idols. He thinks he's curing the Egyptians of their superstition.
And this culminates in a profoundly offensive act. The Egyptians revered a living bull, the Apis bull, as an incarnation of their god. During a major religious festival, Cambyses, in a fit of rage, drew his dagger and plunged it into the sacred Apis bull. He mocked the priests, telling them that a god that bleeds is no god at all.
Then he gets sick.
Oh, really?
Exactly. Shortly after killing the bull, Cambyses is stricken with a severe illness, likely epileptic convulsions. To the Egyptians, this wasn't a medical event. It was immediate divine retribution.
His blasphemy proved their theology.
The gods had struck the mad king down.
And his paranoia just spirals from there. The historical accounts are terrifying. He kicks his own pregnant sister, who is also his wife, Roxana, in the stomach, killing her.
Yes.
He murders his son with an arrow just to prove to his advisors that his hand was still steady. He buries 12 noble Persians alive upside down.
Yeah.
He even condemns Croesus, the same Croesus his father had saved and honored to death.
Although, interestingly, he then repented and was relieved to hear the guards had delayed Croesus's execution. But in a display of pure contradictory madness, he executed the guards anyway for disobeying his original order.
It was a reign of absolute capricious terror. Facing a crumbling empire, a fractured mind, and news of a usurper back home, Cambyses dies under mysterious circumstances on his way back to Persia. Tradition says he took his own life.
So Cyrus built it, Cambyses almost broke it, which brings us to the usurper.
Who takes over?
The usurper who took the throne in Persia claimed to be Smerdis, the brother Cambyses had secretly murdered years earlier. But in reality, this false Smerdis was a Magian priest, a religious fanatic bent on destroying the official Zoroastrian faith and shifting power back to the old priestly class.
Enter Darius the Great. He's a distant relative of the royal line, and he, along with 6 other aristocrats, figures out the ruse. They organize a counter-revolution, infiltrate the palace, and assassinate the false Smerdis.
And because Darius led the charge, he is elevated to the throne. But taking the throne and keeping an empire of 40 million people from shattering are two very different things.
Because everyone smells blood in the water.
The transition of power in an ancient monarchy was universally recognized as a moment of weakness. It was a signal for subject colonies to rebel. They saw chaos at the center, and suddenly provinces like Egypt, Lydia, Susiana, Babylonia, Media, and Assyria all rose in simultaneous revolt.
They stopped paying taxes, they raised their own armies, the empire was tearing itself apart.
And here is where Darius shows a terrifying capacity for extreme violence to establish order. He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't offer Cyrus's leniency. When he finally retakes Babylon after a grueling siege, he crucifies 3,000 of its leading citizens.
Let that sink in. 3,000 crosses surrounding the city walls. It is a brutal, calculated application of terror.
He didn't just want to defeat Babylon. He wanted to send a message to every other province that might be thinking of withholding their taxes.
The message was, do not test me. The era of tolerance is over if you rebel.
Right. He pacifies state after rebellious state in a series of swift, ruthless military campaigns.
But here is the pivot. Once the rebellions are crushed, once the sheer terror has established absolute obedience, Darius puts off the armor of war. He transitions from a warlord into one of history's greatest administrators.
Darius recognized that you cannot maintain an empire of this size with just a standing army and the threat of crucifixion.
Terror only goes so far before it sparks a unified rebellion.
You need systems. You need structure. He set about reestablishing the realm on a foundation of unprecedented bureaucratic organization. He had to figure out how to actually run it.
And this brings us to the logistics. The infrastructure of the Persian Empire under Darius is staggering. If you're listening to this, think about how heavily we rely on instantaneous communication today. We expect emails to deliver in milliseconds.
Exactly.
In the ancient world, distance was the ultimate enemy of the state. If a rebellion started in Egypt, by the time a guy on a horse reached the king in Susa to tell him about it, the rebels could have spent 3 months building an army and fortifying their cities. Distance was a protective shield for traitors.
Darius's engineers had to solve the problem of distance, and they did so by building a network of great roads uniting the various capitals. The most famous of these was the Royal Road,
Which was huge.
it stretched from Susa in Persia all the way to Sardis in Asia Minor, near the Aegean Sea. That is a distance of 1,500 miles across mountains, deserts, and rivers.
And it wasn't just a dirt path that people walked on, it was highly organized. The road was accurately measured in units called parasangs. What exactly is a parasang?
A parasang is a Persian unit of distance equal to about 3.4 miles, roughly the distance an infantryman could march in an hour. And according to the Greek historian Herodotus, at every fourth parasang, so roughly every 14 or 15 miles, Darius built royal stations and excellent inns.
The entire route was patrolled and kept safe from bandits.
The brilliance was the relay system. At each of these stations, fresh horses and rested riders stood ready 24/7. A royal courier would ride at full gallop from Susa, hit the first station, hand the leather mail pouch to the next rider, who would immediately take off on a fresh horse.
It operated day and night, through snow, rain, and heat. Herodotus actually wrote the famous line about these couriers that the U.S. Postal Service later adopted. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, or gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds.
The speed they achieved is what truly revolutionized the empire. For an ordinary merchant or traveler, making the journey from Susa to Sardis would take 90 days. 3 months of hard, dangerous travel.
And for the Royal Mail,
The Royal Mail moved over that same 1,500-mile distance in less than a week.
it was the ancient equivalent of an information superhighway. It allowed Darius to issue commands and receive intelligence faster than anyone else in the world. And they didn't stop at roads. They built massive infrastructure projects.
Yes.
Darius's engineers built pontoon bridges made of floating boats tied together with massive flax and papyrus cables across the Euphrates, and even the Hellespont, strong enough for literal elephants to walk across.
He even completed a canal linking the Red Sea to the Nile, allowing ships to pass between them, though his successors eventually let it fill with sand.
So they have the hardware, the roads, the bridges, the communication networks. Now they need the administrative software to run on it. Darius divided the empire into 20 provinces, or satrapies.
Each was ruled by a satrap, essentially a royal governor. But Darius was astute. He knew that if you give a governor his own province, his own army, and his own treasury, you have just created a king who is waiting for the perfect moment to rebel.
Right, so how do you keep them loyal when they are 1,000 miles away?
You create a highly sophisticated system of checks and balances. To keep the satrap from gaining too much power, Darius appointed a general in each province to command the armed forces.
But this general did not report to the satrap.
No, he reported directly to Darius. So the governor controlled the administration, but he didn't control the swords.
And to make it trebly sure, he appointed a royal secretary in each province, independent of both the satrap and the general. This secretary's sole job was to sit in the provincial court, observe their behavior, and write reports directly back to the central government.
Furthermore, he deployed an intelligence service. They were literally called the king's eyes and ears.
The ancient secret police.
Basically, yes. These were royal inspectors, backed by a military escort who could arrive unannounced in any province at any moment. They would examine the tax records, audit the finances, and review the administration.
And if they found something wrong.
If a satrap was found to be corrupt, hoarding wealth, or plotting treason, they could be deposed immediately. Or, as the historical texts note with chilling casualness, they could be quietly poisoned by their own servants on the king's secret orders.
It's a massive, multi-layered bureaucracy. The satraps, the generals, the secretaries, the inspectors, and underneath them a horde of clerks who actually managed the day-to-day government. The bureaucracy became an entity unto itself. Kings might die in battle or be assassinated, but the bureaucracy was immortal. It carried over from reign to reign, keeping the lights on.
But all this infrastructure, all this peace and order had a colossal price tag. The taxation system established by Darius was essentially a massive, highly organized wealth transfer from the edges of the empire to the center.
The numbers are staggering.
Yeah.
And they didn't just pay in gold. If you're listening to this and grumbling about doing your taxes, imagine having to calculate your payment in livestock. The Medes had to provide 100,000 sheep every year. The Armenians provided 30,000 horsefoals.
The Babylonians had to send 500 young eunuchs every year to serve in the royal courts. Egypt sent enough grain annually to feed an army of 120,000 men.
And that's just the goods. The monetary tribute was calculated in talents of gold and silver. India sent 4,680 talents of gold. Assyria sent 1,000 talents. A talent was a massive unit of weight, roughly 60 to 70 pounds of precious metal.
When you calculate the total monetary tribute coming in every single year, it's estimated at the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in modern currency.
By the time Alexander the Great finally conquered the Persian capitals a century and a half later, he opened the royal vaults and found 180,000 talents of gold and silver just sitting there.
Incredible.
In modern equivalent value, that's roughly $2.7 billion of hard wealth locked in the dark. The empire was a machine perfectly designed to extract wealth through the promise of order.
But we must be clear about what that order looked like. It rested on a foundation of absolute terrifying law. It was a proud boast of the empire that its laws never changed. Once a royal promise or decree was made, it was irrevocable. It became the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not.
Which sounds incredibly noble and stable until you realize the king is the one making the laws, and his mood swings dictate the fate of millions. The king's power was theoretically absolute. He could kill with a word, without a trial, without a reason given. Public opinion didn't matter. There was no voting.
The examples of subservience to this power are chilling because they show how deeply the terror was ingrained in the psychology of the elite. There is an account of a noble father whose innocent son was shot through the heart with an arrow by the king simply because the king wanted to prove he wasn't too drunk to shoot straight.
And what did the father do?
The father didn't weep or attack the king. He merely complimented the monarch on his excellent archery. Offenders who were brutally bastinadoed, which means having the soles of their feet beaten with rods until the bones shattered, would actually thank His Majesty for keeping them in mind.
The legal system itself was this bizarre, jarring mix of fair procedure and savage cruelty. On one hand, they had surprisingly modern elements. Time limits on cases so people didn't languish in jail, they accepted bail, they used arbitrators to try and settle disputes out of court. Judges were even instructed to weigh a person's past good deeds against their crime before sentencing them.
But if you crossed a certain line, if you committed treason, murder, or offended the king in any way, the punishments were barbaric beyond belief. We already talked about Cambyses, but there's a specific story about his approach to justice.
The judge story.
He found out a royal judge named Sisamnes had accepted a bribe to deliver an unjust verdict. Cambyses didn't just fire him. He had the judge arrested and then had him flayed alive.
He peeled the skin from the man's body,
Cured it into leather, and used that human skin to upholster the judicial bench. He then appointed the dead judge's son to take over the job, forcing him to sit on his own father's skin every day as a reminder to not take bribes.
It is psychological terror engineered as a deterrent. They used crucifixion, they used impalement, they smothered victims in rooms filled with hot ashes, and then there was the execution method known simply as the boats or scaphism. I hesitate to even explain it, but it shows the dark creativity of their justice system.
It is arguably one of the worst ways to die in human history. The condemned person would be stripped naked and placed between two hollowed-out boats or logs with their head, hands, and feet protruding.
Just locked in there.
They were force-fed milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea, and their exposed skin was covered in honey to attract insects. They were then left floating in a stagnant pond under the blazing sun.
It's evil.
Vermin, wasps, and maggots would slowly consume them alive over the course of days or even weeks, while they were continually fed to keep them from dying of starvation too quickly.
It is a level of cruelty that is hard to wrap your mind around. Even the military draft was absolute and unbending. The obligation to serve fell on every able-bodied male from 15 to 50.
Yeah.
No exceptions. There's a story of a father who had 5 sons drafted into the army of Xerxes. The father begged Xerxes to let just his 5th son stay home to manage the family estate while the other 4 went to die in war. Xerxes was so insulted by the request that he ordered the 5th son to be cut perfectly in half.
A brutal lesson.
He placed the 2 halves on either side of the road and forced the entire Persian army to march between the bloody remains.
So we have this incredible paradox. The Persian Empire was the most successful experiment in imperial government before Rome. It offered relative peace, rich provinces, economic stability, and local liberty regarding language and customs. Yet it rested on the absolute terrifying, capricious power of a king who ruled by fear and butchery.
How do a people accept that? That's the ultimate question. Terror only goes so far. Eventually, people rebel against pure cruelty. To make a citizen accept this level of absolute submission, to make them police their own thoughts, you need them to believe the king's law is a law of nature. You need a cosmic justification.
Exactly. The law was absolute and unalterable because it wasn't viewed as merely human. In his edicts and judgments, the king was supposed to be literally inspired by the supreme god himself. Therefore, the law of the realm was the divine will.
Any infraction wasn't just a crime against this state.
No, it was an offense against the deity. To understand Persian law, Persian bureaucracy, and Persian violence, we have to look to the heavens. We have to understand the radical, cosmic religion that fueled their entire society, Zoroastrianism, and its founder, Zarathustra.
Zoroastrianism is arguably one of the most influential and under-discussed religious frameworks in human history. To understand its impact, we have to look at the legendary figure of its founder, Zarathustra, or as the Greeks called him, Zoroaster. And like many great prophets, his story is steeped in miraculous legends that elevate him above normal humanity.
According to Persian myth, his conception was entirely divine. The story goes that his guardian angel entered into a haloma plant, and a priest drank the juice during a sacrifice. At the exact same time, a ray of heaven's glory entered the bosom of a noble maiden. The priest married the maiden, the angel and the ray of light mingled, and Zarathustra was conceived.
The legends emphasize his cosmic significance from the very moment he was born. It's said that he didn't cry. He laughed aloud on the day of his birth. This laughter was so pure and powerful that it terrified the evil spirits that supposedly gather around every new life, sending them fleeing in tumult.
He grew up seeking wisdom, eventually withdrawing from society to live in a mountain wilderness, surviving on just cheese and fruit. He faced extreme trials. The devil tried to tempt him with absolute power, but failed.
Like a lot of later prophetic figures.
He endured unimaginable tortures in these myths, having his breast pierced with a sword, having his entrails filled with molten lead, but he never complained, clinging fiercely to his faith.
And this faith culminated in a massive revelation. The supreme god, Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light, appeared to him, gave him the Avesta, which is the book of knowledge and wisdom, and commanded him to preach it to mankind. After years of persecution and ridicule, he finally converted a high prince of Iran, and the religion began to spread like wildfire. But what really matters is the religious landscape he was rebelling against. What were the Iranians practicing before he came along?
Before Zarathustra, the Iranian tribes practiced a primitive religion very similar to the ancient Hindus of the Vedic age. They worshipped animals, ancestors, the earth, the sun. They had a massive pantheon of deities like Mithra, the sun god, Anaida, the goddess of fertility, and Haoma, a bull god.
Right.
The worship of Haoma was particularly intense. They believed this god died and rose again, giving mankind his blood as a drink of immortality. They worshipped him by drinking the highly intoxicating, likely hallucinogenic juice of the Haoma herb. It was a religion of animal sacrifices and drunken Dionysian rituals led by priests known as the Magi.
Zarathustra looked at this primitive polytheism, the blood, the intoxication, and he was disgusted. With the bravery of an Old Testament prophet, he stood up and announced that the Magi were wrong. There were not hundreds of gods. There was only one supreme god, Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light, Truth, and Heaven.
It was a massive theological shift toward near monotheism. Ahura Mazda was the creator of all things good, the whole circle of the heavens. But the system Zarathustra introduced wasn't a simple monotheism where God is responsible for absolutely everything, both good and bad.
Because that creates a theological problem.
Exactly. If God is entirely good, why is there disease? Why do earthquakes happen? Why do innocent babies die? Zarathustra answered this problem of evil by introducing a profound world-altering concept, which is dualism.
Right. He divided the universe into a literal cosmic war. On one side, you have Ahura Mazda, representing light, truth, and the good mind. On the other side, you have his adversary, Achaemenid, Ahriman, the prince of darkness and the living lie.
The entire physical world was conceived as the stage for a brutal, unyielding conflict between these two forces, a war destined to last for 12,000 years. And this elegantly explained all the miseries of life. Ahura Mazda created a perfect world, but Ahriman, the devil, constantly tried to ruin it by creating everything negative.
The list of Ahriman's creations in the source text is fascinatingly specific. He created serpents, vermin, locusts, ants. He created winter, which, if you live in the freezing Zagros Mountains, is a very real, deadly force. He created darkness, crime, sin, and death. He even created menstruation. Basically, anything that caused pain, decay, discomfort, or disease was literally the work of the devil trying to ruin God's perfect creation.
If we step back and look at the historical bleed of these ideas, the echoes of this theology are staggering. When you look at the concepts, Zarathustra introduced a supreme, uncreated god of light, a prince of darkness ruling the netherworld, a legion of holy spirits or angels, a host of evil demons actively tempting mankind. You're looking at the foundational architecture that would heavily influence later Judeo-Christian theology.
It's entirely recognizable to a modern listener. Satan as the busy, wandering adversary, the angelic hierarchies, the concept of a paradise lost to demonic temptation. These ideas passed from Persian theology into Jewish eschatology during the period of the Persian Empire's dominance in the Near East. Remember, Cyrus freed the Jews from Babylon, and from there, these concepts flowed directly into Christianity.
And this dualism extended to the afterlife, which is perhaps its most powerful behavioral motivator. In earlier ancient religions, like the Greek Hades or the early Hebrew Sheol, everyone basically went to the same gloomy, shadowy underworld regardless of how they lived their life. Death was just a depressing equalizer. Zarathustra changed that. He introduced a stark moral division in death.
When a person died, their soul had to walk across the Chinvat Bridge, or the Sifting Bridge. If you were a righteous person, the bridge would widen, and you would safely cross over and enter the abode of song. You'd be welcomed by a radiant maiden, and you'd live in happiness with Ahura Mazda forever.
But if you were wicked, the mechanics of the bridge changed. It would narrow to the width of a razor's edge. You would lose your footing and fall into an abyss of absolute darkness and terror, a hell where condemned souls suffered physical torments, feeding on poison eternally.
They even had a concept of purgatory. If a person's good deeds and sins perfectly balanced out on the cosmic scales, they would endure a temporary clothing punishment for 12,000 years and then rise into heaven.
And it all culminates in a prophesied last judgment. At the end of the 12,000-year world epoch, right would triumph utterly. Ahriman and his demons would be destroyed, the dead would bodily rise from their graves, and the physical world would be remade free from old age, corruption, and decay forever.
I have to point out the absolute brilliance of this theology from the perspective of imperial social control. Think about what this does to an average citizen. It elevates every single human being into a literal warrior in a cosmic battle. You aren't just a passive peasant paying taxes. You are a soldier of the light.
It charges every mundane action with cosmic significance.
Exactly. It's not just don't steal because the king's guards will arrest you, or don't lie because it's against the law. It's don't lie because Ahriman is the living lie. And every single time you tell a lie, you are literally handing a weapon to the Prince of Darkness in the war for the universe.
Yeah.
Every choice you make, every field you plow, every time you tell the truth, you are actively fighting for God.
It gave the common life a dignity and a grand significance. Human beings were not pawns, they had free will. Ahura Mazda wanted them to choose the light freely. This powerful supernatural sanction for morals united the Persian people internally more effectively than any army or any threat of crucifixion ever could, because now they were policing their own thoughts.
And this wasn't just abstract theology debated by priests as high temples. This cosmic battle dictated the absolute minutiae of daily life for the average Persian. How did this belief system translate into how they actually lived, worked, and governed themselves?
The core of everyday Persian ethics centered around a concept very familiar to us, which is the Golden Rule. The Avesta explicitly states that nature alone is good, which shall not do unto another whatever is not good unto its own self.
They broke a man's duty down into 3 primary tasks, which I actually find quite beautiful. 1, to make an enemy a friend. 2, to make the wicked righteous. 3, to make the ignorant learned.
Piety was the greatest virtue, but right behind it was absolute honor and honesty in action and speech. Truth was paramount. In fact, the worst sin you could commit in the Avestan Code, even worse than murder in some respects, was unbelief or apostasy. To abandon the truth of Ahura Mazda, to side with the living lie, was a capital offense punished by immediate death.
But this generosity and truth-telling had a very strict boundary line. It only applied to fellow believers. Foreigners, infidels, were viewed as an inferior species. The theology essentially argued that Ahura Mazda deliberately deluded foreigners into loving their own miserable countries, just so they wouldn't try to invade Persia.
The Greek historian Herodotus noted this profound ethnocentrism. The Persians esteemed themselves as by far the most excellent of men and believed that other nations approached excellence only according to their geographical proximity to Persia. The further away you lived, the fundamentally worse you were.
This obsession with truth and purity also extended to commerce. They absolutely despised trade. They viewed the marketplace as a literal breeding ground of lies. The wealthy aristocracy prided themselves on supplying their own needs entirely from their own estates, refusing to dirty their hands with buying, selling, or haggling. They left commerce to the Babylonians and the Phoenicians.
This concept of purity was intensely physical as well. Cleanliness was quite literally next to godliness. The Zoroastrian code heaped up ceremonial precautions. Parings of nails, cuttings of hair, even the exhalations of the breath were marked out as unclean things that needed purification.
They believed that if you did good works with dirty hands, those works were spiritually worthless. They had severe, strictly enforced penalties for anyone who spread contagious diseases. It was a society obsessed with physical and spiritual hygiene. But they also had some wonderfully contradictory social practices. For example, the way they make decisions.
Ah, yes. The Persians famously debated major matters of state and policy while completely drunk.
I love this detail so much. Imagine the king's advisors sitting around getting absolutely hammered on heavy wine and violently arguing about whether to invade Greece. But, and this is the crucial caveat, they had the institutional wisdom to rigidly revise and vote on those decisions the next morning while entirely sober. If the sober mind agreed with the drunk mind, they went with it.
It's actually a fascinating psychological mechanism when you think about it. Alcohol lowers inhibitions. In a society where disagreeing with the king can get you flayed alive, people are terrified to speak their true minds. Getting drunk removes that fear. It allows for out-of-the-box thinking, preventing groupthink in the ideation phase. Then, the sober morning provides the necessary critical filter. It's an institutionalized, high-stakes brainstorming session.
Let's talk about family and social structure, because this was a society heavily engineered for military survival. The highest value was placed on breeding soldiers. The family was considered the holiest institution. The Avesta explicitly says the man with a wife is above the continent man, the man with children is above the childless.
Sons were highly valued. They were economic assets for the farm and military assets for the king. The king actually sent annual gifts to fathers of many sons, effectively paying them in advance for the future blood they would shed on the battlefield. Daughters, conversely, were regretted as they were seen as being raised for another man's profit.
Because they needed massive population growth to sustain their armies, polygamy and concubinage were widely practiced, especially among the rich. The logistics of the royal court were absurd. The king's harem could contain up to 360 concubines. The rule was that a woman couldn't share the royal couch twice unless she was overwhelmingly beautiful.
The status of women in general saw a tragic decline over the course of the empire. In the early days of Zarathustra, women moved freely, owned property, and directed their husbands' affairs. But after the reign of Darius, as the empire became wealthier and more rigid, upper-class women lost nearly all their rights. The ritual seclusion required during menstrual periods was slowly expanded to cover their entire social lives.
They laid the early foundations for purdah seclusion. Upper-class women couldn't leave the house except in curtained litters. They were forbidden to mingle publicly with men, even their own fathers or brothers. It's incredibly telling that women are almost never represented in the public inscriptions or monuments of ancient Persia.
The code also strictly regulated reproduction and sexual behavior. Fornication or adultery might be forgiven, but abortion was considered a capital crime, worse than adultery, punished by death. And sodomy was excoriated in the Avesta. It was considered an unforgivable sin, a literal creation of Ahriman that nothing could wash away.
The education system was similarly rigid and militaristic. If you were a boy from the unpretentious common classes, you weren't taught to read or write. The Persians considered writing to be an effeminate amusement for clerks and Babylonians. You were taught exactly three things: to ride a horse, to use the bow, and to speak the truth. That's it. Cavalry, archery, and honesty.
The focus on the bow is particularly significant. The composite bow requires immense physical strength and discipline to master, but philosophically it aligns perfectly with their obsession with truth. An arrow flies straight, it hits the mark, it is direct and uncompromising, much like their moral code. For the aristocracy, education extended into their 20s, but it was incredibly arduous. It was essentially brutal physical conditioning.
They were forced to run great distances, swim, survive on coarse foods, march under the blazing sun or bitter cold, and cross rivers without getting their armor wet. It was designed to forge an unbreakable physical and mental hardiness.
When you step back and look at everyday Persia, you see a society engineered purely for power and survival. They did not value art, literature, or science for its own sake. They outsourced science and medicine to the Babylonians. They outsourced their art to hired Greek or Egyptian craftsmen. They didn't even build a navy, they just conscripted the Phoenician fleets when they needed them.
I read that they practiced medicine by using magic spells over drugs, literally arguing that spells won't kill the patient, which is more than we can say for the drugs. They focus entirely on the machinery of empire: administration, law, agriculture, and war.
They were the ultimate pragmatists. They created an environment where millions of diverse people could live in relative peace and prosperity, provided they never ever challenged the central authority.
Which brings us to our final takeaway. When we distill everything we've unpacked today, the sudden rise of the Medes from the Zagros Mountains, the psychological warfare and brilliant generosity of Cyrus, the madness of Cambyses losing an army to the sand, the bureaucratic genius of Darius building a 1,500-mile information highway, the cosmic dualism of Zarathustra that turned peasants into holy warriors, and the rigid discipline of daily life. What are we left with?
We are left with a masterclass in scale. The Persian Empire invented the bureaucratic systems, the communication networks, and the provincial oversight models that would eventually be inherited and adapted by the Roman Empire and, frankly, by modern nation-states. They proved that you could unite disparate, hostile nations not just by force of arms, but by creating a dualistic religious framework that defined every citizen as an active participant in a cosmic struggle for good.
And why does this matter to you listening today? Because whether we realize it or not, we still live in a world grappling with the exact same blueprint. Every modern government, every multinational corporation struggles with the balance that Darius tried to perfect. How do you maintain centralized authority while respecting local customs? How do you use grand, moral narratives, whether religious, political, or ideological, to unite millions of diverse people toward a single goal?
And their theological innovations, the concepts of a devil, angels, a last judgment, a literal heaven and hell outlasted the empire itself by millennia, permanently shaping the spiritual landscape of the globe.
It is an incredible, terrifying, and awe-inspiring legacy, but it also leaves us with a lingering question to ponder as we wrap up. The Persian Empire proudly boasted that its laws altereth not. It was an empire built on the bedrock of unchangeable, absolute decrees from a king who spoke for God. They sought perfect order. But we live in a universe defined by constant, unpredictable change. So is an unalterable law a society's greatest strength, creating unbreakable stability? Or is it a fatal flaw? Because ultimately, the very rigidity that allowed Darius to meticulously govern 40 million people across 20 satrapies, the very system that demanded absolute subservience, was exactly what made their massive, disorganized, multilingual military completely incapable of adapting when they finally met a small, agile, culturally united force on the battlefield, the Greeks. Does an obsession with unyielding perfection inevitably blind a superpower to the shifting realities on the ground? Something to think about. Until next time.